Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Humanizing Pedagogy webinar series. My name is Mukhtar Aban. I'm the coordinator for the Humanizing Pedagogy Praxis and Research niche at Nelson Mandela University. It is an honor and privilege to welcome everyone to the first of our webinar series. We welcome our presenter today, Professor Aslam Fataar, and we also welcome the Director for Teaching Development at Nelson Mandela University, Dr. Noluthando Tony, and she will be doing our official opening.
Okay. Good morning, colleagues. I wish to begin my very brief remarks by thanking and congratulating Mukta and the HPPRN team for the work done over the years, and most importantly, Mukta, for the intricate planning towards today's webinar. Mukta, we are looking forward to collaborating with you as teaching development in advancing pedagogical processes that are beneficial to both students and staff. I'm sure, colleagues, that I speak for everyone here this morning when I express my gratitude to Professor Fataar for accepting the invitation and for sharing via their blog, for sharing aspects of the central thesis of his keynote address. As always, he acted like the distinguished scholar that he is to stimulate our thinking and evoke, at least in my case, thoughts around factors that contribute to holistic curriculum development at different levels. Going through the blog reminded me that teaching is not, or maybe should not, be something that is done to students with the hope that they will learn or master the content or gather a collection of experiences. Teaching, in my view, should be a journey that students contribute to at various levels and various intervals. Thanks once again, Professor Fataar, for forcing us to revisit some of the taken for granted realities of higher education. And Mukta specifically told me to speak for not more than 3 minutes. I think I'm getting there, Mukta. And because of that mental stimulation, I can now confidently say to all of you, to all present via Facebook, on the Zoom platform, I can say to all of you, welcome to the grand opening of our series of Humanizing Pedagogy webinars. We hope that most, if not all of you, will join us in the succeeding sessions. Colleagues, I wish to implore you to take full advantage of this intellectual space. Your participation and engagements will contribute in further exploring the kinds of lessons and changes we can incorporate in curriculum design and delivery, especially at this time of heightened digitization of learning and teaching. Let me hand back to you, Mukta, and ask you to properly introduce Professor Fataar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tony. Before I introduce our speaker, just some house rules. The microphones in the Zoom room have been muted, and you will be able to pose any questions in our Q&A session at the end of towards the end of the webinar. You can just simply ask me by raising your hand or sending me a message, and then I will allow you to unmute yourself. While we are busy with the webinar, you are welcome to post any remarks or questions in the chat area. Professor Fataar and our honored respondent, Dr. Margie Childs, will be able to read them. I also, of course, acknowledge our amazing Dr. Margie Childs from the Faculty of Education at Nelson Mandela University. She's a senior lecturer here, and she will serve as the respondent to Professor Fataar's presentation. On that note, I'd like to welcome Professor Aslam Fataar to Nelson Mandela University once again. Professor Aslam Fataar is a distinguished professor at Stellenbosch University's Department of Education Policy Studies and currently holds a research chair position in the university's Transformation Office. His scholarship resides in the areas of sociology of education and education policy. He is also a former Vice Dean of Research in the Education Faculty. He has so-authored and co-edited multiple books and served as the editor for the accredited journal Southern African Review of Education. He has published over 80 articles and supervised more than 60 PhD and MA theses. Professor Fataar has been recognized for his outstanding service to the academic study of education, as well as his service in the sector. He was awarded a Medal of Honor by the Education Association of South Africa. We are honored and privileged to welcome him once again to Nelson Mandela University. Thank you, Professor Fataar.
Thank you very much, Mukhtar. I'm just sharing my screen, and then I am. Hopefully, you can see the screen now. So, thank you very much, Mukhtar, as well as Nadia for doing the background arranging of this and so on. I also would like to acknowledge the DVC Teaching and Learning at NMU, Professor Cheryl Foxcroft, as well as the Director of Teaching Development, Dr. Nolitando Tony. Thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Tony. I also doff my hat to NMU for this exploring the Humanizing Pedagogy series of webinars. I think it is unique, and no other university, I think, has such a concerted focus on the human in pedagogy in South Africa, and it is something that we can take heart from and learn. So thank you very much for that. This presentation is based on my recent research and writings, and so it is a bit of an overview-ish kind of a presentation. The arguments are a bit large at certain points. I struggle to make some connections at other points. There are references to most of what I'm saying, theoretical, conceptual, as well as research references, which you can ask me about. But if you get lost at some point, because I'm going to follow my text, then I would suggest you just ask yourself the question, so where is this misrecognized student that is making an argument about in the flow of his presentation? I also base my current paper on lots of colleagues, but especially my wife, Najwa Nuruddin Fataar, who is at CPUT, who's done work on this topic, and also people like Bongani Bangeni and Rochelle Kapp at UCT, as well as my thesis students and graduates. I see some of them are on the platform. This presentation is based on my recent research and writings. I attempt to offer some ideas about reframing the purposes of the university. It pivots on a consideration of the institutionally misrecognized student who lives an active yet parallel and shadowy life at the university. Misrecognition, simply in this paper, refers to the inability of institutional and teaching and learning architectures to apprehend this shadowy life of the student. It refers to the university's inability to understand and engage the epistemic worth of its students. So that is a fairly large assumption that I'm going to try to defend through this chapter, through this presentation. If I had to give this presentation 2 to 3 years ago, my thinking would have been framed by the call to decolonize the curriculum, and you would know the context for that. However, decoloniality currently, I believe, needs conceptual augmentation, particularly as the logics of the ubiquitously framed fourth industrial revolution has become visible in society, the economy, and in education. So I want to say something about the fourth industrial revolution before I dive into the heart of the presentation. I recently published an article in the Journal of Education in which I argued that Fourth Industrial Revolution and its logics are not innocent. 4IR ought to be understood as part of exponential, technologically driven, capitalizing logics that's currently featuring on its planetary existence. This logic of 4IR lands in the economic sectors of society, impacting work, job shedding in the repetitive sectors, and new labor demand in the creative economic sectors. 4IR discourse has begun to enter universities, impacting courses and research programs and university partnerships, particularly with industry. An interesting development in the pedagogical terrain is that 4IR has an emphasis on the acquisition of generic skills, things like technological literacy, creative skills, generic skills, and so on and so forth. What is beginning to emerge is an educational architecture founded on open loop platforms involving students who move in and out of different educational institutions and work over a longer time period to acquire microcredit as they move between work and these different institutions. Now, some of these 4IR related developments are occurring imperceptibly. We may not even have a language to fully recognize what they are. But others are occurring via knowledge partnerships with industries, as I've said, and on university programs, such as, for example, a BA degree in philosophy and technology and data, which spans potentially three faculties of a university. However, I think what is clear about the current phase is that the covenant between education and jobs, the link between them, understood as the driver for the education in more recent times. And the idea that education is in some or other direct or indirect way related to employability, skills for employability, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the idea, the covenant between education for citizenship in more democratic times, the times that we have been engaging in over the last 3 decades, that both of these, the education's work and the education citizenship connections, have become dislodged and unraveled. This raises a crucial question for education in today's neoliberal times, which is, how should education respond to the twin challenge of technologically induced unemployment on the one hand, and on the other hand, education that educates for radical and inclusive citizenship? These are two questions that have different genealogies, but they seem to be at the core of how to think through what the purposes of the university ought to be. Education for employment, or in the case of the 4IR, as it's suggesting, technologically induced unemployment, and education for ideological purposes, inclusive citizenship, and so on. If I could just give you a coda and aside about our current COVID circumstances. I've recently argued that educational inequality under the COVID pandemic has deepened and changed in complexion. I use the word transmogrify. So something deepens the pattern, but it also changes. That is in the reference to educational inequality under COVID. For example, emergency rote learning ushered in online screen-based learning experiences for about 20% of South Africa students, even less, I think. This experience is deeply raced, classed, and gendered. The 80% of the rest of the students are mostly Black and poor and are struggling to do their education via online. A survey was done recently by the University of Free State among students at most of South Africa's universities, and I've seen some of the survey outcomes, to determine students' learning experiences under COVID. The survey indicates that the sharing of copy content, simple sharing of materials, copy content by lecturers, have decreased by 70%. So when we were face-to-face, sharing of content between lecturer and student happens, and it may happen unevenly. But when we went online during COVID times, that uneven sharing of content face-to-face online was decreased by 70%. And for me, an interesting figure is that peer support learning activity. The idea that at universities, peers play, as my wife Najwa's research, probably the most important role in concept and content acquisition. In COVID times, peer learning activity was reduced by 70%. These figures require in-depth unpacking, but what is patently clear is that educational access for most students has suffered, has excluded them. Yet, while COVID circumstances have deepened educational inequality, what we've observed and what we've participated in is that it has brought multimodal blended learning platforms into prominence. Under COVID circumstances, technology has overdetermined. Technology has led curriculum adaptation. Again, this requires careful reflection on the lessons that we have learned from taking our curriculum online via technology. However, the time has come for us to open up a theoretical and a research-informed debate. This is not a populist moment where theory and research does not matter. What has to open up in this online space, which excludes, is that we have to insert the central role of pedagogy in what has emerged as blended online learning platforms. Because there is almost complete silence on the conceptual underpinnings of pedagogy when we technologize our curriculum. Technology has led pedagogy as we rapidly took our curriculum online. We have to now ask the question the other way around. In other words, how should pedagogy inform online and blended learning options? This is a conceptual question and it is a research question. There is a emerging global literature on this particular question that frames this debate in constructivist, in design-based, in the use of algorithmic logics for assessment and so on, that retains the epistemological integrity of the teaching exercise with respect to the student who learns via this process. There is a literature that's emerging, and we cannot operate in this space if we do not ask key questions about the relationship between pedagogy and our platforms via accessing concepts and literature. Given some of these remarks on COVID, technology, and the fourth industrial revolution, let me turn to the heart of the presentation, which now takes on a somewhat slightly different hue. The university student is central to my argument. But I ask a simple question. Do we know this university student? And do we know how this university student encounter his or her university education? How does he or she actively live his or her educational misrecognition at the university? That for me is the theoretical question at the heart of this presentation. So the task for me is to start with a qualitatively informed discussion of the misrecognized student who lives in the university's shadows. I find it useful to present a view of students' educational becoming as a journey in respect of how they traverse their various daily environments, trying to understand how they transact their academics lives across these environments shifts the focus to mobility, space, and the body. My research optic is trained on the educational body, as that body moves in and across lived space, or for example, their family, school, neighborhood, lecture room, tutorial space, their peer learning groups, and so on and so forth. In other words, the student's educational becoming is transacted on the move across these multiple spaces. So the question is, what is the educational process as they move across these multiple spaces? And what kind of intellectual meaning and becoming are they involved as they move in and across these multiple spaces? A perspective on the journey of their educational becoming shifts our understanding of students away from classroom learning only. It concentrates on how the dynamics of spaces that they live in positions their educational practices and their concept or disciplinary acquisition. So the challenge here is to move away from a classroom or lecture room only perspective of learning and a middle class understanding of how students learn, to move to an optic that understands how learning is part of life as they move across various terrains and the intellectual processes that they themselves on their bodies establish in order to open up their learning. Students work their way back and forth across the family, community, school, and university divide. They are exposed to the precarity and danger associated with, for example, township living. They are confronted daily with their community's social pathologies. They develop an ability to recognize and circumnavigate the darker aspects of their community and educational life worlds. And they adopt self-efficacy and resilience type discourses, embracing strategically certain kinds of rotes and other practices that narrowly focus on accessing tests and passing them, examinations, and achieving good results. The focus is on the strategic, if I were to use the word horizontalizing processes. By horizontalize, I simply mean how they move across the context of their lives to build a path upward into their conceptual and concept acquisition. Because from such a view, emerges the commitment of students who are motivated by high educational aspirations to succeed. They initially want to become scientists and actuaries and medics, which these high aspirations keep them motivated to gain university education. Their pathways into and through universities are often long and circuitous. The quantitative statistics as well as the qualitative stories tell us this. These students enter the university often by settling for lesser courses. Many are placed on university extension programs. And yet these students harness their mediating capacities to adjust to the requirements of university study. But there's a misalignment and this is the misrecognition. Upon entering the university, this is generically and not about specific universities, but upon entering the university, these students are confronted with uneven educational environments, to put it euphemistically. In many cases, relatively ossified institutional cultures and poorly resourced campus facilities. The Fees Must Fall movement was a reaction to this. So students thus have to establish their mediating struggles, their mediating capacities for recognition at the universities in difficult institutional circumstances. They have to navigate a very varied and uneven field conditions of universities. The educational processes go relatively unsupportive. And while universities, student support services, and so on, attempt to fill the gaps, the mitigations of the universities are often unable to speak into this very specific mediating practices and the capacities and the needs for making those capacities flourish. Universities often lack the ability to speak into that. So the point I'm making here is that a lecture room only perspective of students hides from view the complex mediating, mobilizing, and adaptive intellectual work that students are involved in to make their way into and inside the universities. The lecture-only view prevents us from seeing that. Such a view hides the human and intellectual adaptation dimension of the students, leading to a complex argument, leading to these students' institutional and curricular misrecognition. The misrecognition is historical, it is institutional, and it is curricular. So what a view of the students' intellectual processing inside and outside the lecture room enables, as I've presented, is the opportunity for more complex and deeper institutional engagement, in addition to a greater responsiveness to these students' material support and to supporting them via student service provision. Important to consider is how universities are able to organize what I call in this presentation their instructional core to facilitate students' education. I use instructional core to refer to the specific nature and functional quality of the university's teaching and learning infrastructures. The university's instructional core is inflected by class, race, gender, language, culture, geography, and so on, tied to schooling, of course, what in the literature is called the schooling university articulation gap. On the one hand, we find rich reading and literacy cultures in middle-class schools and communities which facilitate students' immersion into the mechanics of reading, supplemented by cultural capital. Now, this particular view, a cultural capital supported view, informs at the conceptual level the way in which universities function, the view of the students that the universities function by. On the other hand, though, there are the contingencies of learning routines, second or third language acquisition, and a culture of rote learning, repetition, and chorusing that position education in working class schools and university communities in a particular way. This is what universities miss. This legacy of Bantu education is ongoing, flowing into our universities, positioning universities' educational machineries in a particular way. Any expression of an institutional core in education occurs along a institutional practice continuum, ranging from resourced and augmented middle-class scaffolding on the one hand, and reading repetition and rudimentary phonics scaffolding on the other. Where a university's instructional core falls on the continuum depends on the contingent interactions among the university's context, the university's resource mobilization and availability, the university's institutional responsiveness and leadership, the teacher and learning capacitation process at that university, and the nature of that support. So the university's class basis may be an indication of its instructional core, but the argument I make is that when you look at the elements that make up this instructional core, then these come together in a particular way to frame the particular learning culture, climate, and infrastructure at a particular university. So this is not a deterministic reading of university functioning. The particular instructional practice of a university are therefore best understood as a kind of pedagogical fabric that is bound tightly together. This fabric involves the specific combination of student support and so on and so forth, as I've indicated earlier. The quality of this pedagogical fabric produces certain educational outcomes. And understanding the workings of this pedagogical fabric in our various university spaces would provide a productive platform to better connect with and enhance the intellectual processing of our students. So the argument is that leveraging the elements of a university, a faculty, a program's instructional core stands a much better chance of recognizing students and enhancing their educational engagement. The critical point I am making is that leveraging the workings of the instructional core would allow the university to respond to the misrecognition of university students. In other words, the university's reframing spotlight ought to fall on the side of the university and the extent to which it responds to this misrecognition. What is required for universities is to leverage the elements of the instructional core by more robustly aligning it with the students' already active educational engagement processes. So universities have to leverage their elements in order to recognize what students are doing in the shadows, because what they're doing in the shadows to constitute their own misrecognized educational processes is fairly remarkable, those horizontalizing processes. The universities have got to establish a bridge between the formal curricular architectures and curricular offerings and the informal horizontal process of the students to establish a much richer learning experience. As I've been alluding in this presentation so far, the educational practice of students in the university shadows helps us understand how this might work. Students are already actively seeking to access the codes of the university. Peer learning is exceptionally important, as the research shows, in this shadowy existence. In the absence of systemic support, they work out how to engage with the learning. They read how the university functions, which lecturers will help them, which lecturers won't help them, how to mobilize trans-languaging strategies in order to acquire disciplinary concepts. The work of my wife Najwa, as well as Rochelle and Mangeni at UCT, show very carefully about how these strategies are made, including my own work. While these students' practices go mostly relatively unrecognized and unaided by the universities, they nonetheless go on to establish mediating educational practices to mitigate the institutional misrecognition. The argument of this address is that the students' institutional and intellectual practices ought to become the epistemic ground upon which the university's instructional core or pedagogical fabric should be reframed. I come to the last piece of this presentation. This is the knowledge question. which I frame with a question asked more than a century ago. The question is, what knowledge is of most worth to citizens? So there are two answers to this question in the literature. The one answer, knowledge that will make you employable. The other answer is knowledge for democratic citizenship. Often, the relationship between these two are tenuous, and in particular, neoliberalizing context, as I argued earlier on, both of these relationships are in doubt. In respect of the knowledge questions, the decolonizing knowledge imperative joins the claims of knowledge disciplinarity at the university and the claims of knowledge constellations associated with 4IR. A complicated conversation about how the grammar of knowledge, how disciplinary knowledge, transdisciplinary knowledge, and part-disciplinary combinations are now forming knowledge formations. We have to engage in when we consider arguments about what knowledge is of most worth, we have to carefully speak into the ways in which knowledge are currently produced, under which circumstances, what disciplinary and transdisciplinary combinations, and so on and so forth. This is a profound epistemological moment, which requires courageous yet careful conceptual work. Again, my argument is that if we are going to have a populist account of knowledge, then we will not be able to develop pixelated accounts of curriculum knowledge, structures in universities, and so on and so forth. This debate requires thinking about principles of curriculum selection. I argue that observing knowledge boundaries, knowledge structures, disciplinarity, transdisciplinarity are guides in this knowledge undertaking, and that working in disciplined and productive ways across knowledge boundaries to incorporate principles of, for example, Africa-centeredness and contextual relevance is vital. The knowledge question has to be lodged at the center of the university, and it currently isn't. The task is therefore nothing less than being open to all of humanity's knowledge systems, past and present, and in anticipation of future knowledge constellations. This, I believe, would proceed most productively when it lands in faculties, departments, programs, and modules. I would love to see the day when departmental meeting agendas starts off with the pedagogical curriculum knowledge selection question, as opposed to dealing with one or other technical issue about this, about assessment and so on and so forth. The entire knowledge relation ought to be the focus, including research into new knowledge, knowledge production, research into knowledge recontextualization for curriculum selection, and very importantly, in this current technologically dominated age, pedagogy and assessment, where multimodal blended learning platforms of learning must force us to develop a pedagogy-led focus, as I argued earlier. There is much work to be done, much intellectual work to be done. Frames and concepts have to be developed and research has to be pursued. The aim must be to provide the already code-breaking students with the intellectual platform to specialize their consciousness. This is what the purpose of the university is, to specialize their consciousness, as opposed to a church that where you are inducted into salvational practices, or a labor union where you are inducted into the practices of the shop floor and the workplace. The university specializes consciousness, but currently that specialization of consciousness has operated outside of understanding who the student is and what the student's knowledges and intellectual practices are. So my argument is that specialization of consciousness has to connect with, dialectically connect with, the horizontalizing intellectual practices of students as they engage across the context of their lives. Finally, my answer to the what knowledge is most worth question: anticipate unknowable futures. I suggest that the knowledge of the university ought to provide students with the critical, specialized consciousness necessary for the ongoing process of becoming ethical humans, capable of constructing caring and just livelihoods. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that was somewhat coherent and useful. I am looking forward to your engagement and questions.
Thank you so much, Prof Fataar. It's now an honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Margie Childs, who will respond to the presentation. And then we'll be taking questions and comments afterwards.
Good morning, Prof Fataar, and good morning to the rest of the participants. Prof Fataar, if you can stop sharing your screen, that would be helpful. Then I'll be able to put up a few slides. So just as we're working with the technology, the process that I envisage is that I will be responding in terms of an arts-based approach.
Okay, am I off? No. Share screen. You cannot.
Are you sharing it? It's fine. Thank you.
Am I off now? Is my screen off?
Your screen is off. Yes. Thank you.
Ah, goodness. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. My response to considering the misrecognition of students is an arts-based account. Story, poetry, and collage will be used to enter a conversation about the recognition challenges of students. Once upon a time, Professor Wally Morrow, deep thinker and renowned educational provocateur, joined our institution as the Dean of Education. Wally taught us that physical access to the university wasn't sufficient. He challenged us to find ways to provide epistemological access for our students. For more than a decade, Dr. Tobeka Mapasa, Marina Ward, and I have wrestled with the task of providing support to first-year students. We have worked to make the initial educational studies module more accessible by integrating information and academic literacies within the content of this module. As we phased out one BEd curriculum and planned the new one, we realized this was an important time for reflection. Our Open the Book of Learning research project sought to interrogate the student support practices we espoused. We invited colleagues from the Faculty of Education and the Library and Information Services to become our critical friends in an inquiry process. This collage was one of the tools that we used to collect our ideas, starting bottom left. Tobeka, Marina, and I had to examine the baggage that we bring to student support work. One of the processes we used was photo elicitation and metaphor creating. If you look top left, you will see a metaphor of captain of the ship that Tobeka assumed as the module coordinator of the education module. Moving right, I was responsible for academic literacies, and often I saw myself as a mother hen with chickens. Then Moving right again, we see a beacon, and this represented to Marina the information literacy training she provided and the beacon of light to students. In the middle of the image, we recognized allowing students to open the book of learning and turn the pages was important. We had to allow the students to write their own story as university participants. With our critical friends, we thought, we wrestled, we wondered, and eventually we came up with the notion of a garden of hope. The poem, Growing a Garden of Hope, is a found poem that has been constructed based on snippets of text from our research. We are challenged to create a garden of hope where students' needs are met, where all students can flourish, a place where plants of all sizes and varieties survive and thrive. Together with students, we must grow a vibrant learning community, an abundant, welcoming garden. In this verdant space, watering, feeding, and pruning take place. Raw facts sprout and grow. The shining ideal of a humanizing pedagogy sparkles between the foliage. We are encouraged to be. We know we will be tested by drought, floods, storms, and wild wind. We may fail. We may wilt. We need to have the courage to endure hardship and struggle at the mercy of a quixotic climate, mutually vulnerable and mutually dependent. I now turn and consider some of the ideas that Professor Fataar shared with us. In our quest to provide a welcoming space for all students, we acknowledge that we fall short. Many students still experience a shadowy life as they struggle to become part of the higher education community. The image of the towering main building on South Campus comes to mind. Its forbidding concrete structures still echoes a murky past. It casts a powerful shadow. COVID-19 has allowed the shadow to fall further, reaching remote homes to disturb and disquiet data-deprived students. The prompt by Professor Fataar to open to all humanities knowledge systems and to move across knowledge boundaries is one we dare not ignore. Poor and working class students traverse the divide between their communities and the middle class infused university space. As we strive to recognize our students within our curricula and practices, we need to step away from deficit positioning. I propose that we take the notion of mutual vulnerability of students and staff introduced by Andre Kiert, Denise Zinn, and Kimberly Porteous, and extend it. Mutual vulnerability and mutual dependence. Within a higher education context, mutual vulnerability includes recognition of and care for the identities and experiences of students and staff. Mutual vulnerability can be paired with the notion of mutual dependence. Dependence can nurture the reliance between and amongst students and staff. In the natural world, plants and animals have a dependent relationship within a living community or ecosystem. The survival of the community is impacted by the interaction and reliance of the members of the ecosystem on each other. In wrapping up my response, I present a view from the mountain. I close with the voices of our first-year students as they contemplated the view from the mountain. They toiled up the mountain this year with different identities, including Pathway 1, Pathway 2, independent hikers, wanderers in the Moodle mist, data-deprived, deserted, desert adventurers, and lost and disconnected souls. Finally, a word from our students. Giving up is not in my veins. Mkubela Chitelo. I still manage to do my work either way. So I can comfortably say I am now a source of information, a critical thinker. After accumulating information from online sources and from all the lectures, it takes critical thinking to break it down, compile, lay down the work, and give relevant response at the required level with integrity. Ntando Ding.
Thank you, Dr. Childs. Have you concluded?
I have indeed, thank you.
Thank you so much. It was such a dramatic end. I wasn't sure if there's something still coming. Thank you so much, Dr. Childs. We really appreciate your response. We will move over to the question and answer session of this webinar. And there are a few questions I would like to request both Professor Fataar and Dr. Childs to be available for any questions that do arise. Professor Fataar, there are two questions that have been posted thus far. One from Denise Sin. How does one assess a university's class basis? And then would you like to respond to that first, and then I'll pose the second question?
Yes, where am I? Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Zin, and thank you for joining the webinar as well. We will probably be able to have an exceptionally invigorating discussion about that particular question. I think that the reference to class basis, for me, is an acknowledgement, well, not an acknowledgement, but a recognition of the very hard, I use the word ossified institutional culture of the university, the South African university, framed as it has been by an interaction between sort of colonial, sort of modern epistemological tropes. It's come that has a very long 300-year provenance coming out of Europe and so on, which denies the provenance of tropes in kind of other contexts where universities also existed and so on. But the modern university landed in South Africa via the colonial university experience in South Africa, the establishment of UCT, Stellenbosch, and Fort Hare in 1918, and even before that, and so on and so forth. So the provenance has been sort of colonial. And the disciplinary orientations, disciplinary knowledges, subjects and so on, were all kind of came out of that Enlightenment colonial set of circumstances. So the university's class basis is also the idea that universities were by and large conceived in the 18th and 19th century as as limited to a particular class of people, and that is people who are culturally quite aligned to the university experience, but also people have the class cultural basis in order to access it. So the university was kind of very narrowly conceived to serve a particular kind of set of elite formation. And we are still struggling with that notion, with that elite formation of the earlier decades and centuries into the current period. But in the South African context, the student quantitative base has massified to include people who do not come from that class context, nor do they come from that particular cultural orientation. But the university still functions very much on a 200-year colonial trope. The institutional structures, the institutional culture, the people in them, all use, all demographic types and so on and so forth are still fundamentally framework. But what has emerged over the last 5 or so years is to raise the fundamental question about that functioning, and I mean, the key issue there is to ask a set of parallel questions and connect them strategically. Denise, you yourself in your work as a dean and as a DVC will be able to tell us a lot about how these parallel connections work. One is the scholarly engagement process, and that is that people who are interested in unshackling the university from its class basis have to establish scholarship that matters, scholarship that opens up these cultural tropes, scholarship that positions alternative knowledges, scholarship that goes against the grain, that resists, that establishes the other forms. So to become a great scholar that instantiates alternative conceptions of what it means to be human is a key responsibility of academics like ourselves. That's the first thing. But secondly, I think we have to develop our own agency with respect to shifting institutional culture. Institutional culture is often rigid. Universities function in particular ways, but there are openings in visual redress or experiences, in teaching and learning infrastructure experiences, and so on and so forth. And running these two things together becomes important. But also, very importantly, alliance building across particular disciplines, particular faculties, and so on and so forth. There are some faculties that are fairly inert, some disciplines that are fairly inert in with regard to this particular question. And that requires one to establish kind of alliances across the university, conversations, and so on. Take the decoloniality conversation to science and see what happens. Many people are arguing that that's an impossibility. I don't think it's an impossibility. We can have a very disciplined conversation about science and decoloniality without fundamentally threatening the scientific base of those disciplines, but to extend it and expand it. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. A question from Marina Turner. To what extent do you think is the university's role and responsibility to provide informal or semi-formal peer-to-peer virtual spaces in the sense of tutorials, but also social exchange for students? And does it make sense to engage there from a student perspective?
Yes, it does. You see, we are living in a world, without sounding too dramatic, where multimodality, communicatively, literacy-wise, literacy acquisition, knowledges, and so on, are shared via multimodality. And some of these multimodal forms are more powerful than older chalk-talk forms. So education, the view that education only happens in a confined environment between a lecturer and teacher through a top-down transferal of knowledge and so on and so forth. That notion, as romantic as it sounds, is just not realistic. I know why some people hold on to it, because the argument is that the transfer process between the lecturer or the teacher and the student is important. The student cannot, in a constructivist way, acquire concepts and so on and so forth. And there's a very important argument for that, and I listen to my Bernsteinian friends who argue that there has to be disciplinarity, scaffolding, and so on and so forth. That's important. However, that's not the entire story. That is why I'm so keen on emphasizing the disciplined horizontalizing of knowledge processes, is to understand in which sphere you are when you are engaging with students' knowledge acquisitions, everyday knowledge acquisitions, and how that scaffolds onto verticalizing process, if I can use that binary, horizontal, vertical. I don't think it's a binary. I think it works together. But what this requires is, when you are going to use semi-formal, informal, multimodal technologies, outside of classroom technologies and so on, is to understand what your pedagogical principles are. And I think that is the missing debate in the South African, generally speaking, in the South African educational body politic. What are the curriculum selection curriculum modalities that you favor, and what concepts do you use to that process? What are the pedagogical processes? Let me, for example, just throw one thing at you. Algorithms is what propels the technologizing of everything, right? So algorithmic logics is what will colonize us and take over our world and reduce our humanity if we're not careful. However, you have to ask the question about how do you mobilize algorithms for better pedagogizing, for better assessment, for example. And these questions are now beginning to be answered. So you cannot just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, actually, these are sort of anti-human tools, algorithms, technologies, and so on. So we keep them at the door. Well, students' everyday engagements have already picked them up. So you've got to, as a responsible lecturer, teacher, pedagogy, university, you've got to encounter that reality as well. So all of these things are on the table. There is a disciplined set of questions that we need to ask when we do these things.
Thank you, Prof. A question from Deirdre Geduld. How do we humanize our assessment processes when the focus is on delivering students to a neoliberal system focused on highly skilled, uncritical student teachers?
Well, the input-output logic that is currently dominating, and particularly schools and the CAPS curriculum and so on and so forth, that has a holdover in universities. The idea that rote learning modalities and so on is still very much part of us in our entire educational system. And therefore, assessment takes the conventional forms that they do. They come at the end. They are fairly dehumanizing. They don't actually test process in any proper way. There is no kind of developmental assessment attached to that and so on. We are in that particular space. But for me, the question is not simply the assessment question. The question is the pedagogy question. How, in a responsible way, do we establish a pedagogical orientation that dialectically engage across different knowledge forms? That cannot be a transfer question, because you are locating a large part of the responsibility for learning onto humans, onto students. Now, the traditionals will argue that that's a dangerous move. I'm arguing that move is already happening in the lives of students. And when you're conferring responsibility for learning onto students, then that has an impact on your design. It has an impact on critical interaction with material. It has an interaction on project-based design, project-based learning, and so on and so forth. And it has an impact on the entire, what is called the entire curriculum selection process. Students have the ability to select content, working with it, project-based learning, and so on and so forth. Of course, people will argue that in a class of 500 psychology students, how do you do that? Well, I think that even in this space, technology can be used to open up that space so that we can kind of develop more meaningful assessment as development activities in the pedagogical process.
Thank you, Prof. There's a question to both speakers. How do we go about developing a humanizing pedagogy that reconciles university curriculum and the school curriculum? For example, when it comes to issues of language, where in university, the willingness to transform language and its uses is welcomed but totally thwarted in school or even governmental policy.
Does then Dr. Child want to take a stab, and I might respond?
I'm happy to take a stab. I think starting with the university context, we have to pick up on something that Professor Fataar mentioned in terms of the translanguaging practices of students, and then ourselves take this on and plan for it and not expect students to leave their languages at the lecture room door. So that's just a quick answer from our context in higher education. And then as to the school curriculum and CAPS, well, we know it's deeply flawed. So as teacher educators specifically, we have to help our students to be comfortable engaging very much more critically with CAPS and finding the gaps and being comfortable to fill them in ways that are defensible to themselves as democratic citizens. So I'm not giving you many specifics, but the CAPS curriculum is very clumsy and it doesn't meet the needs of many school learners and school teachers, and particularly as we've moved now. So the way that we can influence that is by helping the student teachers that we're currently working with to think about how they could bring up and change the situation.
Thank you. That, in a sense, I don't want to add to that because I'm going to undermine what's being said. Only to say that we have currently functioning in schools a very narrow curriculum and pedagogical orientation that does not prepare students for any robust form of intellectual work, intellectual and student engagement, and so on and so forth. I think we've got to open up that particular experience for our student teachers, for our teachers, and for first year, second year, third year, fourth year university lecturers to enter into that space and to responsibly try to begin to enrich, try to begin to engage educational learning amongst our students so that students can work with critical, interactive, engaging curricular orientations to open up the space. So thank you very much. I just wanted to say to Dr. Childs that I started off my university academic career in the mid-1990s when Professor Wally Morrow was the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of the Western Cape. And it was in that context that Professor Wally Morrow developed the distinction between formal and epistemological access, and opened up and illuminated the relationship between the two and how you have to move from the one to the other in order to give meaningful education. And I struggled with it over the years because it was a very, very, very modernist framing, modernist framing of education, which didn't bring into view the more sort of critical, dialogical, horizontalizing educational experience that I'm speaking about here now. So I think Wally will probably turn in his grave if he hears me speak about the relationship between horizontalizing knowledges and formal knowledges in the way I do. But that is what academic work is about, I think.
Thank you, Prof. I don't see any more questions that have been forwarded to me. So I think we can move over to concluding remarks, closing remarks. Dr. Charles, would you like to make a few closing remarks? And then we move over to Prof. Fataar.
Okay. Professor Zinn asked me to give her some references about digital and online learning. I'm going to give everyone, and she did this privately, but I think it is so important that I'm going to send this to everyone. 2 names. I think you should Google Mary Kalanchis and Bill Cope. What these people are doing, and I'll explain to you by way of my, everyone can see it, by way of my concluding comment. I think this is a very, very important field of investigation. It is the relationship between pedagogy, design-based learning, and technology. So what these people have done, these people are social users of literacy academics. They have done groundbreaking work since the late 1980s, 1990s and 2000 in the social uses of literacy. But about 15 years ago, they took that framing, the social uses of literacy, in other words, how social literacies are acquired within particular lived contexts. They took that particular framing and moved it into what is the pedagogical entailments of technology education. So they have designed a number of projects that produced a number of texts where they unfold almost like a step-by-step way about how design-based project learning would work that utilize technology responsibly in terms of the pedagogical question. It is a very useful, almost path-breaking work that these people have done over the last couple of years. So thank you very much. And thank you very much by way of conclusion for this very nerve-wracking presentation. It's not always easy to do it over Zoom, but hopefully I was able to do some justice to it. And thanks to everyone for organizing it. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof Fataar. Dr. Childs, any concluding remarks? Let me. Okay, there we go. You are still muted, Dr. Childs. There we go.
Thank you. So thank you for the opportunity. It's been good to think with you, Professor Fataar, and the participants. And I'd like to support the resources we've been given in Kalanzas and Cope. I use them as a theme linked with the understanding of lockdown. And we weaved notions of our language and our literacy learning. And we've come up with very interesting responses, multimodal responses. So I really support that source, and it's been quite groundbreaking.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the Humanizing Pedagogy Praxis and Research Niche, as well as on behalf of the LT CoLab, Dr. Tony is also present. We'd like to thank our presenter and respondent, Professor Fataar and Dr. Childs, for this really thought-provoking presentation. I'd like to thank all the participants for joining us in the Zoom room as well as on Facebook. And we'd like to encourage everyone to please sign up for our next webinar on Thursday, in which we will be having Professor Salazar and Dr. Lick presenting and responding. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Prof Fataar, once again, and do take care and stay safe, everyone. Goodbye from all of us.